Welcome back to part two. Back on with the conversation.
Yeah, so you were asking me about or you were telling me sort of your arguments against what Dave was saying, and saying, well, basically, if we had the power to just kind of like bring the whole military home, well, why would we, not focus on the other externalities like welfare and taxes and things like that? I mean, I think the answer is basically that we don't have that kind of power to do any of these things. And so, in terms of what's like realistically on the table, what we have to realize part of what Dave's getting at in that sort of reductio hypothetical is that the political will in America right now is that like left and right are sort of united in being concerned about immigration. And so Dave's trying to tap into that with his platform to say, yeah, isn't it kind of crazy that we have all these problems on our own border and yet we're trying to be the empire ruling the world? Like, shouldn't we bring our troops home and just focus on our problems here? And so uh, I'm all for that as a talking point, and I think that that's a useful way to engage with uh, it is more often than not conservatives, but there's even people on the left who are becoming sympathetic to that argument as well. And so, using a little bit of populism to push people in a more libertarian direction sounds good to me. Now, is border enforcement libertarian? Well, national borders are just not libertarian at all. So, like by definition, they aren't. Um, but again, the move of abolishing that isn't on the table, and so I'm not sure what sort of solutions are on the table that wouldn't have the status quo still end in something that's not libertarian, And if it's kind of like if we were driving a car, so we're using the analogy that Dave used, like, hurtling towards the cliff at 120 miles per hour versus slowing down. Well, if you want to turn away from the cliff, it is kind of hard to turn a car in the complete opposite direction if you're going 120 miles per hour. But I would also say that we're not just trying to turn the car around and avoid the cliff. We're also trying to head to the destination we want to go. And for as long as it takes for us to get there, we will be in terrain that's ultimately not our destination. And so, similarly, while we are trying to get to the libertarian future we want, every step along the way is going to not be the libertarian future that we want. And so, I think the problem is libertarians have been stuck in this quagmire for a long time where they don't know how to get out of theory and get into the real world to be politically active in a viable way. Uh, the Libertarian Party here in my home country of America has often been a sort of joke in terms of like people will pay attention, like, oh, what are the libertarians saying? It's like, oh, we're having debates over driver's licenses and sidewalks and things like that. And it's like, well, that seems a little tone deaf. Like, why are we focusing like that is uh the wrong fruit to be looking at right now. And so rather, I think we need to focus on what's, the easy victories that are more immediately obtainable, that low-hanging fruit. And then, excuse me, I'm having some allergies here. Uh, I almost had a sneeze and I managed to ward it off. So,
It'll creep back up
uh,
on you in a minute.
yeah, yeah. But and then beyond that, we need to find the incremental steps that we can take that do two things. One, reduce the overall amount of aggression happening. And then B, get people more in line with our thinking. And so, what I brought up to Dave in terms of a solution, is trying to find a way to decentralize how the border problem is being solved, and to be like, listen, maybe abolishing the state, abolishing the border, not happening anytime soon. But this whole thing that's going on with like Texas wanting to enforce the border and the federal government like saying, well, we don't want you to. We're going to remove federal funding if you try to do that, whatever. Like, well, maybe we should just tell people, like, you know what, like, whatever, like, just don't take the federal funding and do it yourself. Like, enforce your own, like, Texas decides who comes in, who comes out. Arizona decides who comes in, who goes out. Now, again, is that an ideal solution? No. But if I'm faced with two options, option A is we have one policy for 50 states and that's enforced by the giant federal government through agencies like ICE and the Department of Homeland Security. That seems like just a terrible option. If the other option is we say, you know what, there's no reason California needs to have the same laws as Texas, right? So if the immigrants want to go to California, let them go to California. And if Texas doesn't want the immigrants, then Texas has the power to say, no, we don't want them here, or to set different limits, different guidelines, things like that. Um, that to me seems to do both of the things that I was talking about. It seems to be a overall reduction in aggression because I think there's just no way that scaling back from ICE and the Department of Homeland Security doing this to individual states doing it. I mean, put it this way, we're already almost as bad as it can get, it seems, in terms of like the border is kind of weird because you have both things happening at the same time. You have massive human rights violations where sometimes people are being, have guns pointed at them, they're being locked up and shipped off and deported. And then you also have the other end of the spectrum where people are just kind of like encouraged to come across and so again, that's kind of the left and right are like looking at both. Problem is like the border is not like this one point of entry. It's this, you know, hundreds, thousands of miles stretch of land where like both things are happening simultaneously. And so it's like, yeah, depending on where you zoom in on, you'll find all sorts of different types of problems, right? So, but there are a lot of human rights violations happening, and I think that there's no way that I can't imagine we would see an increase if we decentralize that back to the states rather than having the federal government do it. And then again, we'd be promoting libertarian ideas of decentralizing. Now, obviously, we wouldn't want to stop there and just be like, okay, now the states are in control and that's it. Like, like we've won. Like, no, we need to keep going. And it's like, okay, people in Austin, Texas might be like, well, hold on, we want the immigrants to come here. We want to hire them. Like, we want to, we want to put them up. It's like, fine, then start lobbying for laws that, like, you'll find ways to get the immigrants here and they can be in Austin, Texas, but maybe other municipalities can. So then that'll start conversations that lead from decentralizing from federal to state to local. And suddenly, I mean, this isn't going to happen all at once, but as we move down these tiers, we're getting closer and closer to, hey, what if instead of doing these things through states at all, what if we decentralize all the way down to the individual, to self-owners, and to private property based contracts and things like that? That seems to be a way to kill two birds with one stone. Is it going to be perfect? No, but again, I don't. There is a mountainous gap between us and the libertarian future we want. Like, it's not just a large distance, but the way I've often described it is that I think that the distance between us and the future we want is going to have peaks and valleys, meaning it's not just going to be this perfect incremental decrease of the state the whole way to where we want. We might, as we're doing things, and again, we're not just like there's not just one axis here, right? You have things like you have taxation, you have borders, you have laws, you have the military, drug laws. There are so many things, and so the idea that they're all even going to go down at the same time, like we're probably going to have drops and spikes, two steps forward, one step back. We're going to have peaks and valleys as we climb over this terrain to get where we want. But the one thing I know we can't do is just stay where we are theorizing about these ideas. We need to actually do something. And although I'm not going to say like I 100% agree with every way that Dave has presented the arguments or the ideas that he's suggesting for how we need to proceed, I at least appreciate the heart of where he's coming from, that he wants to proceed. He's challenging libertarians to engage in the real world so that we can get out of just talking about these ideas, but start actually pushing the Overton window. And I think doing that through capturing things that are happening in the moment to capture the populist wills and channel those in the most libertarian direction possible while we're such a minority. That's, I think, the best short-term path we have, while also pursuing long-term things, which are more like culture and education, the raising of our children, things like that. So it's kind of a multi-tiered approach.
Sure, yeah, I understand that. I mean, funny enough, when you said about the two things happening at once, I mean, I agree with you with regards to like the border situation, but all, with two things happening at once. And it also reminded me of like during like the BLM stuff, where you had on the one hand, you did have some peaceful protests where police were going in there and violently just attacking people who weren't doing anything. And
Yep.
then on the other hand, you simultaneously had areas where people were rioting and the police weren't doing anything. And you were like, so again, and it feeded into both narratives because the left looked at these peaceful protests that police were abusing their powers and assaulting people, and they're going, well, look, you know, these are peaceful protests and the police are out of order, defund the police and all the rest of it. And then on the other side, you had all the right wingers saying, we're seeing images of people just smashing into windows and looting places and burning towns down and saying, well, no, we need the police to do something actually, you know, and if anything, they're not being heavy-handed enough. And you know, and it's yeah, and it's a similar thing to what you described with the border thing. And sometimes I think, in fact, often I think, I'm not going to pretend that it's sometimes, I always seem to think this must be intentional, like the people that are
Yeah.
kind of in charge, because it seems to be, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It does seem to be because they couldn't. Well, if it's not intentional, they're getting very lucky on how everything's kind of firing up both sides, and it's that old divide and rule. They get the left and the right bickering at each other, and no one's looking up at the people who are screwing us all over. So, um, yeah, so I understand what you're saying, and to be honest, I do agree with a lot of what you said with regards to like Dave's position on this, because I mean I'm very loath to criticize Dave in any way because he does so much good for libertarianism. I mean, he brings this to a bigger audience than probably anybody else. You know, he's been on like Joe Rogan and stuff like that, and also I think he's got a good range because he'll speak to smaller like you know channels and stuff as well as talking to like you know big, so he has a good range. He hasn't quite spoken to anyone as small as me yet, but but you know he seems like a genuinely nice person, and for the most part I think he represents libertarian principles very well. I do disagree with him on the border thing, and although I get where he's coming from, because there is, you know, there are these real externalities, and our principles don't just save us from reality. You know, we do have to deal with that. The thing that worries me a little bit about Dave's approach, because ultimately national border enforcement is in itself anti-libertarian. You know, regardless of all these other justifications we might give, it's still an invalid border that's being violently enforced. And one of the things that I don't, and this might be an area where we disagree. I don't even like the decentralization idea of states doing it, because it's still the same violation. You're just saying, okay, well, let the states do it instead of the central government. But the same issue from a libertarian point of view is still there. It's like, well, they still can't do it. And one of the things that I heard Dave, and I don't know if I'd like to run this by you because I don't know if you could agree with this or disagree with this, but one of the things that Dave kind of used an example of, he said, well, we can do it because, you know, in like a private property society, we would be able to enforce the borders through private property borders. And I'm thinking, no, we wouldn't, because even with, because the thing is, like, our whole libertarian argument for why we can't enforce national borders is, let's say, look, we can enforce a private property border because a private property border is just the perimeter for our private property. So we have a right to deny others that because it's ours and it's not theirs. But the reason why we don't have a right to enforce a national border is because then we're not just prohibiting people from the private property that we have a right to prohibit them
Right.
from, but we're
Yep.
also prohibiting them from traveling to areas that we don't have any right over or say over. And the thing is that's true whether the government is enforcing it as a state border or whether a bunch of private property owners are all getting together to contrive their property in such a way that they're creating a border. The same violation still exists. And the example, the kind of, it's a bit of a simplified analogy, but just to kind of hammer the point through, I say, like, you know, because I think a lot of libertarians fall into this trap that we invoke property rights, but sometimes we forget that we've got to stay faithful to those same property rights. Like, we're allowed to protect our property borders to protect our rights. But if, for example, if I decided to build a bunch of properties surrounding your house with no easements, no passages or anything, I could essentially imprison you on your own property just by building a bunch. And I would say, well, I'm only protecting my private property borders because it's only my private property but I've put my private property in a place that has essentially imprisoned you in a way that you can't leave your property without trespassing on mine. Just like the idea that Dave seems to be presenting is that, well, we could have all these private property, this private border wall or whatever. And I'm like, well, it's the same problem. It's you can only prevent people from going onto your property. You can't prevent them from going past it to other places. And that's the kind of part that I can't get round. And while I do understand that there's still this consequentialist outlook of saying, well, okay, well, what's going to get us, because even if I think I've won the ontological argument, we still got to deal with the consequentialism because we live in a real world,
Yeah.
and there's real world consequences. But I also think that one of the reasons why, as a general rule, I think we need to always go with the ontological thing, even to guide us from a consequentialist perspective, is because we can't always predict the future. And while I can understand why Dave thinks that, okay, well, look, by giving a bit on this, and and not alienating myself from people on the left and people on the right who may otherwise embrace libertarian principles, I'm going to bend my principles and I'm going to twist them and even break them a little bit just in this little area. And I just feel like doing that, like, this is an opportunity for libertarians to point to the libertarian solutions, to say, look, this is the problem when you have a welfare state that we don't have any control over, and taxation. And I understand that these things aren't just going to, I understand it's pie in the sky to say we're just going to get rid of those things. But the problem is I feel like by opting for an unlibertarian, or in this case, an anti-libertarian solution, I feel like we compromise all of the, and like it takes energy and focus away from the libertarian solutions and makes them even more unattainable. Like, someone like Dave has a lot of power. And like I say, I don't want to badmouth him anyway because he does so much good work. But he has that level of power and that influence. And he's in this position with the immigration thing where he could sort of stand firm on the libertarian principles and say, yes, the border issue is a nightmare, but it's a nightmare because of these externalities, and the libertarian solution would be to get rid of those externalities. And the reason why I don't like his position is because instead of doing that, he's saying, yeah, this is a nightmare, perhaps we should do the status solution on this one issue because things are that desperate, because from a consequentialist point of view, I feel like it would get us to a libertarian. I do understand that he's still doing it in the name. He's not trying to portray libertarianism. He's still doing it with the ultimate goal of thinking that it's going to get us closer to libertarianism. I'm not casting aspersions over what he's trying to do. I understand that, but I think it's misguided, because I think, and this is why I think we always have to have that ontological guidance, because I don't think we can predict the consequentialism in the way that we think we can. And by compromising our principles along the way, thinking that it's going to get us closer to a libertarian future, I think it actually gets us further away, because someone like Dave, who can make this point very clear with regards to why we can't enforce immigration, like the border and all of that, and stop immigration in that way, but why there are these libertarian solutions that we should be pushing for, and why, because the thing is, I'm not one of these accelerationists who just want to see society crumble so I can go, ha ha, told you so. I don't want to do that. But the fact of the matter is when these things are happening, it is an opportunity for people who are promoting libertarian principles to point to this and say, look, this is caused by that. So instead of breaking our principles to fix this right here in this kind of patched up way, this root cause over here, which has a libertarian solution to it, no matter how unrealistic it may seem. I mean, the thing is as well, the other thing as well is even playing within the state, because that's the thing, I worry about libertarians playing the statist game too much, that we end up just becoming statists begrudgingly because we feel like going the libertarian way is too unrealistic. But the other problem I have with it is when we're dealing within the statist system, I feel like we need to take the libertarian solutions that are available even within that statist paradigm. So let's say, for example, okay, we're not going to end taxation, we're not going to end the welfare state, but maybe we could reform the welfare state so that immigrants can't so easily access our resources, they can't get on welfare, they can't go into the schools, stuff like, we could, that's not quite so pie in the sky, certainly no more pie in the sky than the proper border enforcements that many right-wingers want. You know what I mean? But the difference is that's a libertarian solution. And I just worry that for all the good Dave does, and like I say, I don't want to badmouth him in any way because I've got utmost respect for him. As much as I disagree with him on this one issue, and I'm obviously, I'd like to one day debate him on it, but as much as I have that disagreement on that issue, he does, there's no question the good that he does. And like I say, it's the only issue. I mean, one of the things I often have conversations with libertarians, I always try to find the areas where we disagree to have the conversation, because that's where obviously it's interesting. It's boring to just have a conversation where you're just both agreeing with each other. But sometimes in that conversation, what gets lost is how much commonality there is. And I'm with Dave on, and you on, like 99.9% of the
Yeah.
stuff. But there is this one area that I think he has got wrong, and potentially you have as well. And I do want to pick at it. I do want to push at it, because if I'm missing something and I'm wrong, then that back and forth and that pushing and challenging of each other's
Yeah.
positions will help me understand it. And also, if Dave's wrong, which I think he is, it'll help him see it through the constant, debate. So I do understand, because I get frustrated as well. It's like, we're debating to the end of time while the world burns, kind of thing. So I do understand that, we do have to take action, but at the same time, one of the reasons why the debates are so important is we want to make sure the actions we take are the right actions. We don't want to let haste kind of overtake prudence, if you know what I'm saying. And
Yeah.
that's kind of my concern. So I do understand the real world thing, but I suppose my two kind of basic points with regards to the opposition with Dave is, one, I do dispute his claim that it's libertarian what he's advocating, because I don't see how he can really make that claim. State borders aren't valid, and even if they were private property, we couldn't, as I said, we can't stop people from going anywhere other than into our property. But I also think from a consequentialist point of view, from that real world point of view, I also think there's an argument to be made to reconsider his position, because I actually think that it doesn't have quite that consequentialist advantage that he thinks it does. Because yes, maybe we can ease the pressure that immigration is causing, but we're going to do so at the expense of our principles, and we're going to lose an opportunity to at least show where a lot of these problems are being caused at their root. And that's like a big thing that I feel like someone like Dave is in a position to be able to do. So yeah, I don't know if you've got any sort of
Yeah.
thoughts on that.
So the first point about his argument not being libertarian, I think you're partly misunderstanding him. So let me try to pull apart what I think his position is. So Dave would say, and obviously like this is going to vary by platform. Like he's, not always necessarily depending on the platform he is. If it's like the first conversation he's having with somebody, he's not going to like, okay, cool, I'm going to dump. We just do a total like, 100-pound dump of all libertarian theory at you the first time we talk, right? He's going to be strategic, and there's nothing wrong with that. But in general, if you press him to be like, well, what's the libertarian solution? He's going to agree that like, well, it's obviously abolishing the state borders and having a private property society. So that's the libertarian position in terms of like what is just the correct like libertarian view of like our principles, right? Um, what Dave is saying regarding what we do now is that it is within the world of libertarian thought and literature what he's proposing. Because there are other libertarians who have suggested that, uh, because what we're dealing with is sort of the mess created by public property, right? And so this is commonly referred to as the tragedy of the commons, because it is property that exists without a clear private property established, through the norms of private property, an established owner with the then exact moral right to exclude people and manage it as they see fit. So when you have public property, whether that's a public park, whether that's the welfare state, all these different things, you have this tragedy of the commons where you don't have the exact proper way to arbitrate the usage of it and who can use it, who can't use it. You have the problem of the free users, freeloaders, things like that, that people worry about, and that causes, it increases the amount of distortion and the externalities that the state intervention beyond the initial state intervention of the theft and creation of the public property in the first place. So what Dave is saying is that, all right, so how do we Dave's like answering this question. what do we do about the commons? What do we do about public property until we get to the actual position of privatization? And so there are different, and this can be different depending on the example you're talking about, right? Because some things there probably aren't like good incremental steps. It's like, what do we do about the IRS? It's like, well, we don't want to decentralize the IRS, right? We don't want to privatize the IRS, like I said earlier. Like, we just want to abolish it. So there are some things where it's like, it's like state departments and things like that just need abolished. Bad laws just need abolished, or whatnot. I mean, maybe with taxes you can do some compromises, like yeah, like reducing the taxes from like 40% to 20% or something like Trump did. Okay, that's fine. But so it's gonna kind of be a case by case basis. But what Dave is saying is that, in the same way that, so like, let's take like a micro example, like a public school, and we can say that, well, a school is not a thing that like necessarily needs, like, schools aren't evil, right? Like, schools would exist in our private property society. You could even imagine community schools being invented, right? And you can imagine the community creating a trust or like a corporation or something that would own the school, and that the people living in that community would have like discounted rates and more accessible like direct use for
Sure, yeah.
that school or something. You could say the same thing with a park, like a community park. People wanted to find a way to, uh, if they didn't want to have a private park that was like owned by one person and they set all the rules, they wanted a community park that was kind of more free to use. There are ways you can do that in a
Yeah.
private property society. So what Dave is saying is, okay, when we're looking at the public property of like a school or a park, well, although we agree that it's public property, it's illegitimate, we shouldn't view that as like unowned and as if the people in that public space don't have a right to exclude others, right? So we wouldn't say that, and there are some goofy libertarians and ANCAPs that I've encountered on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it, who disagree with me on this. But my position is that, like, for example, I think that if a random adult, doesn't even have to be like a homeless person, 'cause people will often go to like, what if it's a homeless drug user? I'm like, I think even just a random adult, if they don't have a kid in that school, I think you have a right to exclude them from that public school. And then even more so, you would have a right to exclude someone who's shooting up drugs, or like if they were like a convicted sex offender or pedophile, right? You could exclude them from that school, right? Like, I don't think it's a violation of, now some people go like, but that's a violation of their natural rights because they're not actively committing any aggression. I'm like, but like, okay, like maybe in pure try, here's the problem, right? Public property and I'm not a Sternerite, but I do like using Sterner language. So public property is a spook, right? So the problem is, we are when anytime we're in public property or in the commons, the space that the state has created, we are no longer in the natural world. We are kind of in the land of fantasy. And so trying to apply the principles of natural law perfectly to something that was created through a distortion of natural law is not going to be an exact 1-to-1 ratio, like things are just going to work out perfectly. Because if you do that, you can come away with conclusions like you can't exclude pedophiles from public schools, which, by the way, like, there are people who have definitely said that to me on Twitter. That's a bit of a reductio ad absurdum, right? Like, I think you even have the right to exclude a random adult who doesn't have a child in that school, unless they have some like official business there. But like, if I traveled to like England, I don't live in England. If I just went there and started walking around roaming the public schools there, I think they'd have a right to exclude me because, like, I don't have any business there. Like, it's so.
Yeah.
But then
I
like,
get, sorry, go on.
and there are people who not only disagree with that, they disagree with the reductio case of like, what about a pedophile? They're like, well, if the pedophile is not actively violating anyone's rights, you can't exclude him from the public property. I'm like, okay, well, that's a little bit insane. So Dave's saying, listen, public property in the commons, because they don't have a clear owner, does not mean, and because they were funded illegitimately, does not mean that the most pragmatic, the most wise, or even the most libertarian move right now is to try to apply the perfect libertarian natural law to it because it's just not going to work. Instead, what we can do is understanding how the private property society would manage that property. We can then say, well, maybe this public property should then be uh,
Treated as if
pushed
it was
to be
private.
treated as if it
Yeah.
was private property. And so you can say, even though the public park was funded through taxes and that's illegitimate, okay, it's already been done, and now like I always say, like, okay, now if you had, like, I don't know, every person in the community out there protesting saying tear down this park, then I guess maybe this doesn't work. But I'd say for the most part, the people in that community have sort of like post hoc sort of like accepted, like, yeah, this park exists, we like it, we want it to be there, and and they want their funds to be used to maintain that park and to keep people who shouldn't be there off of it. So I think you treat the park like that in that example. Now, does that scale up perfectly to the borders?
No.
No. But um you so the I'm with Dave on the micro example. I do think it's a little bit harder to scale that up to the entire border. Part of why Dave and I had a conversation, I was so friendly to him, was because when he made the public property examples about the schools and the parks, so many people were like, "No, you can't even do that." And I was like, "Well, that's crazy." I was like, "That's crazy." I do think trying to then say we should enforce the national border, um, based on that justification, is a little bit messy. And I've said that I think Dave needs to do a better job of trying to articulate that point. I still prefer what I would say, which is I think it'd be better to decentralize it. And I'm also not against sort of like the Hoppian sponsorship system in terms of another middle ground where it's like, hey, people can come here, but they need to have like private property owners who are sort of like, they're going to um, anyway, that's a lot there. There's more I could say, but I'll let you let you jump in with any thoughts you have or any pushback.
Yeah, I've got the 10-minute warning again. um, I didn't know. Did you want me to just try and finish it up in this 10 minutes, or would you be willing to go another section?
Um, I mean, I can probably go another 15 minutes total. So if you want to close it and reopen it quick,
If you don't mind, because I've got about 7 minutes according to this, and I don't want to rush myself with a part three. Is that
yeah,
okay?
that's fine. Yep.
Okay, and we'll only do 10. We won't do the whole half hour. We'll do like 10, 15 minutes or something. So, I'll
Okay.
speak to you again in a few minutes. Thank you.
Yep.